welcome to Religion Off the Beaten Track with Robin Douglas, a podcast on the lesser-known aspects of religion and belief.
Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of Religion Off the Beaten Track. I'm your host, Robin Douglas. Today, we're joined by Dr. Will Pooley of Bristol University. Will is a specialist in social and cultural history, with particular reference to folklore and popular culture in France. Will, welcome, and thanks for being with us today.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, today we're going to be talking about witchcraft in France, in particular in the 19th century. Let's start by trying to get this idea of witchcraft nailed down, because it's something which can mean different things to different people. For some people, it might mean pagans dancing under the moon. For some people, it might mean an old woman who cures your warts. For other people, it might mean black magic. So what exactly do we mean by witchcraft here?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a good question, and it's one that I always try to be really clear about in my work. I've been very fortunate to, when I first started out on this road, I had, as one of my colleagues, Professor Ronald Hutton, I've always drawn on his definition of witchcraft, which is now almost 20 years old, I think, the definition which he proposed in an article called Anthropological and Historical Approaches to Witchcraft. It's a very thorough definition, but for me, the most important aspects of it are that when we talk about witchcraft in this kind of specialist research context, we're talking about the belief or suspicion or worry, shall we say, that living human beings can cause harm through supernatural means. And that's the core of the definition. When I talk about witchcraft in my work, it does have to be something that's being effectively done by living human beings. So we're excluding ghosts, we're excluding spirits, we're excluding deities, and it does have to be harmful. So we're very much thinking about this as something that people fear and resent more than the kind of positive aspects of witchcraft, which other people, of course, are interested in.
So this is essentially a hostile term. This is something it's a label that people apply to condemn the people who are being referred to.
Yes, I mean, I do think that's the core of it, is that it's a term that people apply to others. I would say that despite the fact, so it is a very negative term, and it is in general a term that people apply to others. And for instance, the anthropologist Jeanne Favre-Sada, who worked on the same material in France in the 20th century, she came to suspect, there weren't really any witches. There wasn't anyone doing black magic. There wasn't anyone deliberately trying to harm with supernatural means. I mean, I would say that having looked at a lot of material from the 19th century, it's clear to me that people do. I mean, there are people who try to harm other people using magic, but in general, it is negative, yeah. So it's not the kind of thing that people want to admit to in public, shall we say.
Okay. And related to this, there's a counterintuitive element to the gender of witches, isn't there? There were some regions of France in which witches were mainly seen as being men.
I think the first thing to say about this is that the material available for the 19th century is the coverage of the whole country is not, it's not as good in some regions as it is in others. It's not as bad as the materials that survive from the early modern witch hunts in France, for instance, but it is still worth saying that there are aspects of this that we'll probably never know the answer to just because the records don't survive. But in general, there's a really clear pattern of male witchcraft in the north and the west of France. So there's an area of western central France around the Bocage. There's a few départements around there, which is where the anthropologist Jeanne Favre-Sada did her fieldwork, where there is a lot of fear of witchcraft, and most of the witches in those cases are men. That kind of region of masculine witchcraft really stretches up into Normandy and, to Flanders. In a sense, most of the regions of northern France, where there is a pattern, it tends towards male witchcraft. Whereas in southern France, you could draw a line from Saint-Malo to Geneva, which is the line that people often use in French history to kind of differentiate between two quite different types of France. The witches in that region do tend more often to be women.
Okay. Well, that's very interesting, and the regional variation aspect of this is interesting in general, because of course this is a period, isn't it, in which French identity is coming together from what had previously been different regional identities. So do we have several different witchcrafts rather than one French belief in witchcraft?
Yeah, absolutely. I would very much agree with that statement. I think there are regional and even sometimes micro-regional traditions of witchcraft which come across very strongly in the source material that I look at. But of course, one of the things about being a historian of this kind of topic is that the source material itself has a very strong national flavour. So, in some senses, it's brilliant to be a historian of 19th century witchcraft because the French state is quite well organised. And they're trying to treat all of these different things in a very similar way across the whole of France. So I can go to an archive, in Rouen, and the documents will look very similar to the archive that I go to in Lyon, which is a long way away. And in theory, they're treating all these things in the same way. So yes, absolutely, a lot of different kind of regional flavors to how witchcraft is. How witchcraft is understood to work in communities, but at the same time, the source material is very often trying to treat this stuff as all the same.
Yeah, it's really the clash between a pre-modern belief and the modern state in many ways, isn't it?
In some ways it is. Although I suppose, and I think I'm arguing along similar lines to many of the things that Owen Davies has been saying since the 1990s about this material. In some ways, it is a continuation of a kind of early modern tradition, for instance, but in some ways, these traditions adapt remarkably to new contexts. So one aspect of that, particularly on this issue we're talking about, is that I think there's a lot of evidence from the 19th century that people who are involved in witchcraft conflicts have become very savvy at using the modern court system to pursue their grievances. And that's not just people who are who feel they've been wrongfully accused of witchcraft and that this kind of belief belongs in the past. I think that people who believe in witches often find ways to use the courts to persecute people who they suspect of witchcraft. So they accuse them of poisoning, for instance, or they take them to civil courts. And there's quite a few examples of that, which I find interesting.
Yeah, this is something that surprised me when I started looking at this. There are hundreds of trials, aren't there, that involve witchcraft in the period that we're interested in?
Oh, there's a lot. I mean, my numbers vary depending on, I'm going through the research materials which I've been working on for many years now, but I have around 1,000 cases where the police or the courts were almost certainly involved and where we're definitely dealing with some kind of suspicion of witchcraft in that tight sense as I defined it at the start. And then in addition, I know of a few thousand more, which I've kind of keep on my back burner, where things aren't quite so clear cut. So where the magic that's involved isn't really witchcraft, for instance, or where I'm dubious that the case really happened, because in my experience, if I can't find police investigation or court records, then sometimes I start to suspect that the material might have been made up by newspapers. Yeah,
I imagine that newspapers are a major source in general for this period. I mean, certainly, but by analogy with England, in England you have rising literacy, you've got falling press taxes, and you have this body of information that suddenly appears. Is it the same in France?
It is the same. I mean, obviously it's the same, and in some senses it's a little bit different. But there are some very similar processes. Again, Owen Davies has written very well about this, and Thomas Waters more recently as well. There's very similar processes in terms of a kind of relatively steady growth in press circulation and also press readership. But of course, it kind of happens and stops and starts. So in France in particular, there are various censorship regimes between 1790 and the 1870s, which affect that. But the newspapers play this really interesting role in these witchcraft disputes because they do, in a sense, they report on these cases with horror. They're kind of scandalized that this stuff is still happening. But at the same time, clearly it makes for good reading. And definitely into the early 20th century, which is when my research stretches into, you get more and more interest in kind of investigative reporting into witchcraft, which is quite interesting. And yeah, there's definitely an entertainment aspect to it.
That then leads on to a question which I find particularly interesting, which is, when did these beliefs die out? When's the last mention in the newspapers or any other source of witchcraft accusations?
I don't think we've lived through that moment. I don't keep a good record of this, and part of me wishes that when I started this research, I'd made sure to do this, but a very quick internet scour will turn up cases like this that have happened in the last few years. The one I always remember, because I did manage to get a screenshot of it when I came across it, was Brive-la-Gaillarde, which is in kind of southern France. And there was a case there in 2016 where an elderly woman, I think, was assaulted by family members who thought she was a witch. So the cases definitely continue to happen. And I also think that it's worth considering that the media and legal context for the cases has changed a bit. And I sometimes wonder if there are more cases than you would find from avidly following the media, because people are more aware of the sensitivities, kind of cultural sensitivities around reporting on some of these cases.
That's very interesting. Okay, let's take a look at the big political picture. People like me who might have a fairly shallow knowledge of France in this period might think there was essentially a two-party system as far as religion was concerned. There might be an assumption that you had conservative Catholics on the right, and that you had secularists, people who were against Catholicism and often against religion generally on the left. And it seems to me that what you're working on here is a body of beliefs and practices which simply don't fit into either of those categories. Yeah,
the conflicts over witchcraft that happen across this period have this tendency to become a political football for that debate you're describing. You know, there's a growing kind of press presence of anti-clericalism in the late 19th century. With the relaxation of censorship laws, you get a lot of publications whose main kind of editorial message is how bad the church is. Well, obviously, they like to look at these conflicts and say there's an easy culprit to explain why witchcraft beliefs are still causing problems in these various places, and that culprit is the church. You know, the church teaches people all sorts of silly ideas, and then, of course, they end up believing in things like witches. But on the other hand, the Catholic press, which has always been, you know, there's been a kind of consistent tradition of Catholic newspapers across the 19th century because they haven't been quite as subject to censorship. Their argument has always been that actually you get these conflicts in regions where the power of the church has been weakened, and in a sense, these unorthodox beliefs flood into that kind of vacuum that's left by the absence of the moral authority of the church.
And which of those two sides do you think the evidence tends to favour?
There is some truth to what Catholic authors said about this, in the sense that there is definitely a correlation, shall we say, between some rather unorthodox Catholic developments and witchcraft conflicts. So, for instance, the church in France known as La Petite Église, they don't recognise the authority of Rome after the reconciliation between Napoleon and the Pope, because they're still basically angry about what happened in the 1790s during the French Revolution and the refractory clergy. So they don't have any clergy. So they end up being, you know, they're kind of cast out of the Catholic Church and they remain outside of the Catholic Church. They crop up in quite a few of these cases. People from the Petite Église are kind of engaged in witchcraft disputes. So there's some evidence that the vacuum left by the retreat of the church in some periods in some places could have contributed to these conflicts. On the other hand, I mean, I think the strong evidence in favour of what the anti-clerical side of this debate have to say is that if you draw a map of where there are lots of these conflicts, it does happen to be a map that aligns very closely with Catholic observance in France.
Okay. One thing I was going to ask about, which links in with this, is whether there was any kind of urban-rural divide. Is there any truth to the stereotype that witchcraft beliefs would linger on in more supposedly backward country areas as opposed to modern educated cities?
Yeah, I mean, I'll answer that question with one word, and then I'll kind of explain myself, because it's taken me a long time to admit this to myself. Yes, honestly, it is true that there are more witchcraft concerns in general in the countryside than there are in the city. I think I used to be very resistant to the kind of simplicity and neatness of this, and I maybe in the past have overemphasized. I've tried to find the problems with that argument and complicated a bit. So I think it's not a simple story, but the fact of the matter is that witchcraft conflicts do seem again to be strongly correlated with certain types of community. You know, communities that are used to face interaction, communities where people depend on one another in a certain way, and where, you know, if somebody is behaving in a way that causes problems within that community, that it's a real life or death issue, that does tend to be the kind of community where you're more likely to get these suspicions of witchcraft. And those communities aren't really urban communities in general. I think the thing that, you know, the complicating stuff that it's really worth saying is that when people become involved in a conflict over suspected harmful magic, very often the actors who become involved in that conflict will come from a range of different spheres. So a lot of the people whose role in these conflicts, for instance, is to try and help people who suspect themselves of being bewitched, you know, what we'd call in English perhaps unwitchers or cunning folk. Quite a few of those people, in my experience, might be urban based, and there are indeed some of them have kind of essentially small businesses, even professional offices in major cities. So there are definite urban connections there. And as the period moves into the late 19th and into the 20th century, one of the consequences of the kind of popularity of mesmerism, spiritualism, modern occultist practices, I think you do get an increasing number of cases where people are really worried about harmful magic, which take place entirely in urban contexts and are dealing with quite different thematic links. So there is an urban tradition, a continuing urban tradition of suspicions of harmful magic, you know, including some very famous cases in the late 1880s and into the 1890s. There was this case where some of the most famous occultists in France accused one another of casting black magic on one another, and when one of them died in 1893, it was widely held that, you know, he was murdered by black magic. So.
And is the aside from the urban-rural divide such as it exists, is there evidence of a class divide? Do you have state officials approaching these cases in a different way from ordinary working people or farm workers?
There is definitely a differentiation in class in these cases. How to describe that kind of complex situation? I think the easiest way to describe it would be to say that a lot of the people who end up involved in these cases, in terms of people who are worried that they've been bewitched, they don't come from the poorest parts of society, but they definitely don't come from the more affluent parts of society. So they tend to be smallholders, you know, farmers, maybe not that smallholders, but people who work their own land, and some of them will be labourers who work for other people as well. You very rarely see cases where people who are kind of more obviously middle class or aristocratic suspect themselves of being bewitched. I think the thing I would say about that class dimension is that I've long suspected, and, you know, it's the kind of thing that's very hard to prove, but it's very hard to know whether people who are better off just would never end up finding themselves in the situation where they had to get involved in criminal proceedings. Because you do get the feeling with a lot of the cases that make it to court, people almost feel bewildered that they've ended up in this situation where they're going to face criminal charges for whatever their role was in a particular witchcraft conflict.
Yeah. And as to the legal dimension of these cases, I have to ask, is there any record of anyone actually being convicted of witchcraft? Does the court ever accept an accusation of witchcraft as factual?
So the simple answer is no. In terms of the backstory to that, France is relatively early in decriminalising witchcraft. Effectively, witchcraft is decriminalised in the Kingdom of France in 1682. And then during the French Revolution, when they rewrite their penal code, one of their kind of clear aims is to get rid of any offence that was in the previous penal code that had to do with religious belief, and they include witchcraft under that. So witchcraft as a crime is definitely well gone from the legislation. That doesn't stop people, of course, trying to bring cases for witchcraft, and sometimes those cases even make it to minor courts. So particularly justices of the peace are sometimes a bit annoyed, I think, to find themselves having to deal with cases where someone has brought a case accusing someone else of being a witch. I don't know of any successful cases, but there are definitely some limit examples, and there are two kind of important sets of topic where you do get a kind of limit example, and there's a poisoning, which I think I've already mentioned, and the other is cases to do with suggestion and hypnosis. So I don't think it would be fair to say in either case that anyone is ever really convicted of witchcraft, but certainly there are a lot of cases where people involved are not sure if what they're talking about is a real kind of pathological poison, biochemical poison or some kind of chemical that's harmful to people, or whether it's achieved by magic. And it's often down to the police and the authorities to decide between those two options when they're trying to decide whether a case is worth prosecuting. I think at the end of the day, they do have to just make a decision. If this is definitely poison, then they will prosecute. And if it really sounds more like witchcraft, then they don't prosecute. The other limit case that I've mentioned, is suggestion and hypnosis. So in the late 19th century, especially, a lot of medical thinkers get interested in ideas about suggestion, suggestibility, and this concept of hypnosis, the idea that some people can use certain methods to control other people's intentions and will. And there are a set of arguments over this which are never really resolved in the French criminal courts. But there are definitely cases where people succeed in arguing that they acted under the suggestion of a hypnotist of some kind. And one of the things that lawyers do in cases involving witchcraft is they will try and persuade the court that when people talk about witchcraft, they're actually talking about a real process of hypnosis or suggestion. There's an infanticide case I know of from 1890, for instance, where the sentence is reduced because the woman who's killed her newborn child, her lawyer successfully argues that she was actually acting under the influence of a kind of rural hypnotist who was actually a co-worker who she believed had magical powers.
So, in a sense, you have accusations of magic being translated into an acceptable idiom for the courts.
Exactly. And it's never, so I wouldn't say it's a hugely successful strategy by lawyers. So it's never a strategy that I can't think of any examples where it completely gets a murderer off, for instance. But what it does tend to do is it tends to muddy the waters, and it confuses juries, which is very important because juries are notably unreliable in this period, and they're quite prone to lenient sentences towards people who've committed acts of what we would consider extreme violence if they're a bit confused about why they did it.
Okay, well, we've spoken about the legal dimension of witchcraft. What about the medical dimension? How did these beliefs interact with doctors and the medical establishment of the time?
So the story in France is quite an interesting story from this point of view, because I think a lot of historians of medicine have noticed this fact, but the French have very strict medical practice laws from very early in this period. From, I think, 1803 is when the first very strict medical practice laws are introduced in France. And they essentially say, if you want to practice medicine as a doctor or a surgeon, or indeed a midwife or a health officer, which is the other auxiliary health practitioner, you must have gone to one of our approved schools. You've got to have your certificate. You can't just go out and be treating people unlicensed. So in theory, from that point onwards, the French state is very keen to repress any kind of medical practice that is unlicensed. And it's very, very easy to prove that lots of people who are involved in kind of discussions of witchcraft are doing that, because, in your typical case, when someone suspects that something's wrong in their life, or it could be witchcraft, they'll consult someone else who has a kind of specialism in in dealing with witchcraft, and very often that specialism sounds a lot to us like healing ailments, so you go to someone and you say, oh, my animals are dying and I have unexplained headaches. Well, if they're offering to help you with those headaches, then they're beginning to do kind of unlicensed medical practice. The thing that's interesting, I think, is that actually I know of a lot of cases like this, like 600, 700 cases or so from across the 19th century. But that's not that many cases, considering how many people were clearly doing this. And I think really the number of cases depends on periods and particular areas where there were very zealous prosecutions of these individuals. And for the most part, I think authorities would often like to have just pretended that nothing like this was happening.
I see. So it's something of an embarrassment to people in positions of official power.
Absolutely. I think there is a real issue there. On the one hand, so France is divided into départements, and then each département is ruled by an intendant for most of this period. So the intendant's political reputation, these are careerist men. Their reputation depends on, proving that they're a good manager of this département. And I think very often they want to demonstrate their zeal, but they also don't want to lift up the rug and reveal all the things that they've already swept under there, if you like. So they're caught in an interesting position.
So that means that officials had an incentive not to record things which might be embarrassing. It sounds like that puts historians in the familiar position of having to guess what evidence hasn't been left behind.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's definitely a real problem. I mean, I think when I look at the other scholarship on cunning folk, these people who are practicing things that we might recognize as medical healing or adjacent to medical healing practices, I think the suspicion is, certainly from what I've looked at in France, that the people who are being prosecuted are the most brazen. They're the ones who maybe push their luck a little bit too far. So they treat a lot of people, they do it very publicly. Maybe they ask for money. They're doing it in a way that the authorities find they can't ignore.
On the issue of evidence, there are huge problems in general, aren't there, with researching a clandestine subject, which would have been stigmatized by most of the people who made the records.
The problem with this always, and with the topic of magic and witchcraft more broadly, is that so many of these practices are deliberately secretive. The fact that we do not know what we do not know is a real problem for this topic in particular, because it suggests it might be the most important stuff that we can't get access to.
Do we find any useful information in the church archives by any chance?
So that's an interesting question. I've never got very far with ecclesiastical sources for this topic. There is one set of sources that is really good on this from France, which is kind of parish reports. I mean, so quite often, for whatever reason, a bishop might ask local priests to write a report on their parish, and of course they're incredibly assiduous in fulfilling this task. And some of them essentially write small monographs about the history, folklore, customs, and so on of their parishes. And I've looked at the ones in the Long de Gascogne, for instance. Yeah, some of them are legitimately significant works of folklore in their own right, and better than some of the stuff that was published at the time on the folklore in the region. So those can be quite good, but I think their preservation and also their kind of their value and interest is it's essentially dependent on the local priest and what they were interested in. This is a bit of an admission from me. My first book was about folklore, but I have struggled to find the folklore collections directly useful for this witchcraft research. I think I still struggle to believe, in a way, that what the folklorists are talking about when they talk about witchcraft is the same thing as what people are talking about when they get into these kind of life and death conflicts over harmful magic. And
what do you think the disjunction is there?
I think there are lots of things going on here. There's the phenomenon which Fabre Sada identified in the 70s, which is that this is a dangerous topic, and to speak to someone like a folklorist about it honestly would be incredibly difficult for anyone who is really involved in a kind of witchcraft conflict. I think that's one aspect of it. I mean, I think that the the standard thing, which we always have to say about 19th century folklorists, but remains true, is that they have, very clear, a very clear role in shaping the material that they collect for their own reasons. That's not a simple, those reasons aren't simple. They aren't all romantic nationalists or even regionalists. They aren't all nostalgic for a kind of rural past, but they do shape the material. So they're much less likely, of course, to publish material that seems fragmentary or incomplete. So in the work that I did for my first book, which is on a folklorist in southwestern France, I went and looked at his papers in the archives down there. And of course, his papers are full of these little legends, which are kind of 4 or 5 lines long. And they're completely unpublishable in the sense that I don't think even specialist folklorists at the time would have been interested in such fragmentary material. But from the point of view of a historian, they're a lot closer to say, some of the material on witchcraft conflicts.
So folklorists would have been presenting a smooth version of their source material. It would have been carefully edited with the oddities and fragments taken out.
Absolutely. And I think also very often taking social conflict out, and I mean that in the sense that, of course, a lot of the folklorists, not all of them, but a lot of the folklorists were quite resistant to thinking about whether, the communities they were dealing with had social inequalities in them, whether indeed, they were perceived as kind of powerful outsiders by their informants, and issues like that. But also just the sense that people within communities have incredibly different attitudes to questions like, questions of belief in witches or ghosts, or indeed any of those topics.
This takes us into an area which I know you've researched, which is the nature of belief. Presumably folklorists and the other people who created our written sources would have had quite a Christianized view of belief, the idea that it's something straightforward and binary, and that wouldn't have reflected the way that the people in question believed in witchcraft and other such things.
Yes, exactly. That is exactly one of my chief objections. I think that if we treat the kind of attitudes and cultural phenomena that get bound up in a topic like witchcraft as if it's a faith system, I think that we're doing quite a disservice to its complexity, because it's not, there's no institution that sustains witchcraft as a belief in the modern world, in the sense that there is, if you're an organized Christian church, you're an institution. There's no set text. There's no authority. No one written authority that sustains this coherent faith system. I mean, I do think, along with that, the mistake of seeing it as something akin to a religious faith, the other mistake is exactly like you say, this kind of concept of a binary. And there, I would also put some of the blame on this legacy of Enlightenment thinking, which I think is still very much with us, which holds that the term that you want to pair with belief is skepticism. And so when I talk to people, my favorite way of late, as I think of talking about witchcraft, is to describe it as a doubt. And I think the unfortunate consequence of using that language I've found is that people assume that what I mean is people who doubt do not believe. And that is absolutely not what I mean. So an Enlightenment sense of belief is, there are people who believe in things, and then skeptics have an absence of belief, or they're against belief. We talk about various ways that skepticism sets itself up against belief. But I actually think that when we look at the material and try and listen to what people say about a topic like witchcraft, they don't say that they have absolute faith in it in the sense of a belief, but they do talk about doubts in the sense that ethnographers of doubt have been interested in, which is a state of, it's an attitude that involves ambivalence. It's an attitude that involves, shifting positions. So it's not a firm belief in the sense that it doesn't have a stable referential object. It's not, you can't consciously say yes or no to whether it's true, but it's not the opposite of belief in any sense. It's a set of belief attitudes. So that's a long-winded kind of attempt to explain why, yes, I think that I see witchcraft, at the moment, I see witchcraft as a kind of doubt system.
So if you'd asked a French person in Gascony, let's say, in the 1830s, do you believe in witchcraft? Then that very question would be meaningless. That person might have a sort of shifting combination of views in their mind, which might change over time and might not rise to the level of what we would call a firm belief or conviction.
Absolutely. I think that's one part of it. I think the other part of it is the point from Jean-Fabrice Sada again, which is that as an ethnographer, if you ask that question, you might think that the question you're asking is straightforward. But as an informant, when you're asked that question, it's not the question that's been asked to you, but the question is immediately about what power relation is involved in being asked this question. Why do they want this information? It's translated into a whole set of concerns around witchcraft, so that the answer that you'd get, whatever the answer is, even if they say yes or they say no, it's not really the answer about their deep-seated conviction about witchcraft. It's about a relationship with another person.
So our hypothetical peasant from Gascony might think, who is this mysterious, well-dressed stranger who is asking me this? Why is he asking me? What's he going to do with the information?
Exactly. Or indeed, how dare he ask me? Or, to ask me is to insult my intelligence, because the sources are absolutely clear about this. They are aware that outsiders and urban people especially consider any talk of witchcraft to be backward, to be primitive, to be ridiculous. So, in a sense, that one of the first things I think any question like that will communicate to an informant is it's an insult.
So not only do we have an imperfect paper trail from the past, but at the time when that paper trail was being created, the process of creating it doesn't necessarily reflect what was truly in people's minds.
Absolutely. And it's not a kind of insoluble problem. I think it's worth thinking about ways that historians have traditionally overcome issues like this. So, obvious solutions include looking at what people do. So I've been quite interested in this idea that no matter what people say in some of these records about their attitudes to witchcraft, we might consider actually just the actions they've taken. So a really stark example of this is that people who commit violence against people that they accuse of witchcraft, a surprisingly large number of those people then deny believing in witches when it comes to trial. And I just think that in itself is pointing to something very interesting about the relationship between stated attitudes and belief attitudes and actions. And I think there is a legitimate case to be made there that we might want to think about their actions as communicating their belief attitudes just as much as their words did.
And of course, there are lessons from this far beyond the boundaries of witchcraft or 19th century France.
Yes, I do. So I've been very interested in this concept from the philosopher Gendler on alifs, and she's really interested in this idea that there are things which we might want to liken to beliefs, but that in fact do not meet all of the conditions of belief, in the sense that we very often act in ways that are inconsistent with what we think we believe to be true. So the kinds of examples she gives, I just think are really wonderful examples. One example would be taking a picture of a loved one and putting it on a dartboard and then throwing darts at it, and your mind doesn't want to do it. I love that example because, of course, it's very witchcrafty, isn't it? There's the symbolic. The reason we don't want to do that is exactly the kind of logic of witchcraft. It feels symbolically dangerous to harm an image of a loved one. And so I do think, yes, it's a set of issues that is of much wider significance, in the sense that we want to believe that we know what we ourselves believe. But in fact, of course, our minds are very complicated when it comes to dealing with what our attitudes are.
Well, that seems like a good note on which to end. There's a lot of food for thought there, both on the subject of witchcraft and more generally. Thank you very much, Will Pooley.
Thanks for having me.
You have been listening to Religion Off the Beaten Track with Robin Douglas. Remember to follow us on Twitter and Facebook.